We spoke earlier about how Russiagate has impacted media. I want to ask you specifically about progressive media. One of my biggest frustrations about Russiagate was how it enlisted so many leftist outlets in promoting the national security state narratives that they are supposed to be challenging, and in some cases once did, I think, very bravely. I'm thinking specifically of two outlets, your former outlet, The Intercept, and I know that them parroting the CIA line when it comes to the Hunter Biden story, that was a major factor in your departure. And I'm also thinking of my former outlet, Democracy Now, where I worked for over 10 years. Now, I have noticed that they have not had you on in a very long time, not even when you were indicted for your Brazil reporting, the one that exposed the campaign to undermine and imprison Lula. And this was surprising to me, especially because, I mean, you were a guest for a long time on many issues. And also, during Russiagate, I think you actually saved their reputation because while they were going along with it with pretty much every other guest, including interviewing a Trump Russia conspiracy theorist as their primary voice on Russiagate, you would come on occasionally and debunk it. But since then, I've noticed that you are among those who they're not interviewing anymore. And I recently spoke to Jimmy Dore about this, where they've frozen out many people who we used to interview when I was there, like Stephen F. Cohen, who recently passed away and wasn't on Democracy Now! For the last 3 years of his life, starting in April 2017. He died in September 2020. And what I said on the Jimmy Dore show was how sad I was about that because this leading progressive show denied its audience of the leading critic of Russiagate and of the new Cold War that it was fueling. And that was part of a trend, I think, towards parroting the establishment narrative. So I'm wondering if you are now a victim of this too, if you have also been frozen out of Democracy Now, whether you're a victim of this trend in progressive media to isolate voices that challenge the establishment narratives that they used to challenge too.
For sure, for sure. I think the only reason why they did put me on to talk about my skepticism of Russiagate was because they had me on constantly to talk about anything in the news. I would say over the last decade, from say like 2010 until maybe 2019, I was definitely one of the most frequent guests on Democracy Now, maybe the most frequent. Maybe there's some people on more than me, but they would have me on constantly. I'd be on there all the time. So they were kind of having me on to talk about my Russiagate skepticism, almost to spite themselves. Because I was one of the people to as a guest whenever it would come to national security or foreign policy or media debates. And I think the last time I'd been on Democracy Now was mid 2019. I think I went on the last time to talk about the Brazil reporting that we did. It was like maybe a month after we broke the story. And I'm pretty sure I haven't been on since, including, as you said, even when I was indicted, when I got invited by every media outlet in the world to be interviewed. Even CNN invited me on. They eventually canceled but covered it. And then, I think the book that I just published is my sixth book. The first book I published was in 2006. I've been on Democracy Now to talk about all 5 of my books. The first week that it came out, they immediately asked me. In the case of this book, which is a book about my confrontations with the Bolsonaro government and the exposés I did on the corruption at the highest levels of a right-wing Brazilian government, my publisher, which is a small left-wing publisher, because I had a contract with a big publishing outlet, and they said, if you want to write a Brazil book, go ahead, and then you can do the book that you have with us after. So it's a small left-wing publisher, which is Haymarket, that is a great relationship with Democracy Now. They place almost every one of their authors, even ones who are obscure and not very well known, on Democracy Now. Called Democracy Now or emailed them and said, hey, we'd like to put Glenn on, and they just got no response. Clearly, I'm blackballed from Democracy Now, a show that, as I said, I've been on probably more times than almost anybody, if not more times than anybody, because of my dissent. And what's so amazing about it, Aaron, is, as you covered recently in a segment that you did with Jimmy Dore, they'll put anyone on to talk about books. They had Stuart Stevens, a lifelong GOP operative who worked for George Bush and Dick Cheney and Karl Rove. And he wrote some shitty book about how the Republican Party used to be this like noble, kind, compassionate, integrity-driven party, meaning under George Bush and Dick Cheney and Karl Rove, and Trump ruined it all.
Look, I think that George Bush believed very passionately in an idea of compassionate conservatism. I know he did. I saw it. And the party's just lost that sense of right and wrong as being led by Donald Trump. And one of the lessons I really take from this is how much leaders matter. I think the party could have been led in a different direction.
But he went on and poured that book out. And Amy and Juan Gonzalez talked about this book like it was such an important piece of political literature. And he got to talk about how George Bush was genuinely a compassionate conservative. And they didn't say, well, isn't like rendition and torture and like Guantanamo and lying to destroy Iraq and letting New Orleans drown contrary to the view that compassionate conservatism reigned in the Bush years? They said nothing. He was treated like, because what happened is the Trump era broke everybody's brain in the center left or left wing media, not everybody's, but almost everybody's, to the point where everything became binary. You were either pro-Trump or anti-Trump. And if you were anti-Trump, you are considered to be an ally, somebody who is, deserves adoration and support. Bill Kristol, David Frum became stars of MSNBC because of that framework. And that's what led Stuart Stevens onto Democracy Now! Conversely, if you weren't sufficiently anti-Trump, if you didn't shape your entire politics to oppose Trump, if you didn't endorse every lie disseminated in the name of stopping Trump, you became an enemy to the point where you are blackballed. So Democracy Now!, which always, like The Intercept, conceived of itself as airing dissident and marginalized voices, it wasn't just me. They don't put anyone on who's banned from MSNBC or CNN because of left-wing dissent, even Matt Taibbi or yourself. It's just they are indistinguishable from all of the liberal outlets that they always perceived and conceived of themselves as being opposed to. And they're no different. They fit perfectly into the kind of Vox, MSNBC, Talking Points memo, pro-DNC media. They do nothing different. All the people they put on could easily go on those programs and do. And all the people they ban and exclude are excluded and banned from those same networks. And that has contaminated so much center left and left wing media that, it's almost impossible to find distinctions between them and CNN or the New York Times at this point.
And that's the tragedy, is because it's meant that for institutions like Democracy Now!, who I fundamentally regard at the core of it are noble. I really do. I was there for a decade. I worked with many of the people who are still there. I work with Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez. These are noble people at their core. But the tragedy of this era is, as you say, it broke people's brains, and it's led to people abandoning what makes them great and what makes them stand apart. And even on the point of it being anti-Trump, it's nominally anti-Trump. But I mean, one of my biggest frustrations was that you couldn't have a bigger gift to Trump than to fixate on a conspiracy theory that he's a puppet of the Russians and to put your faith in Robert Mueller to find the smoking gun. I mean, that's really what being anti-Trump meant over the last 4 years. So in reality,
well, and not only that, just like to add to that one point, I mean, of course, anyone who is, center left or left is anti-Trump in the sense that, you don't agree with his ideology, you don't agree with his policies. But, during the Bush years, the independent left-wing outlets like Democracy Now! Or like the more radical, left-wing bloggers and writers didn't just confine themselves to saying Bush and Cheney and the Republicans are terrible, because that was being said by Paul Krugman and, liberal writers at the New York Times and MSNBC and Keith Olbermann. What made places like Democracy Now! Genuinely bastions of dissent was the fact that they would point out all the ways that the Democratic Party was enabling those policies, was supporting those policies, just like they did the entire time that Trump was in office. They were constantly, the Democrats were empowering Trump with larger military budgets, with greater surveillance powers. So often their actions in policy did not match their rhetoric about Trump. And being a critic from the left of the Democratic Party, not just of the Republican Party, which is easy, is always what was the defining attribute of these outlets, and that made them so important. And they lost all of that. And they also lost any willingness, even that it wasn't necessary for Democracy Now! Or Amy Goodman or Juan Gonzalez to agree with my views on Russiagate, or to agree with what you just said, which is exactly right, which is that this obsession with Russiagate was obscuring all of the other real, attacks on core liberties and economic justice and everything else that the Trump administration was doing. They don't have to agree with that, but nonetheless air it, invite people on, ask hard questions, and they just stopped doing that. If you were radioactive to the left or to liberals because you were deemed insufficiently anti-Trump or anti-Russiagate, they would just not have you on. They stopped becoming a venue where dissenting voices could be heard.
And finally, there's one thing I want to address when it comes to DN and also the Intercept, because I think it applies as well, is that there are all sorts of theories as to what accounts for these editorial shifts. Why are both of these outlets not just peddling Russiagate, but also going along with the national security state on issues like Syria, which to me is one of the biggest national security state scandals ever, just the amount of money that was spent on a dirty war and how much the truth of that was obscured. And I don't think it's something nefarious, some sort of overt kind of someone tells someone, if you cover it this way, then I'll give you funding for Democracy Now! Or in the case of the Intercept, it's Pierre Omidyar, the owner, saying anything. I think it's simply just how manufacturing consent works, the propaganda model of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. And part of that is simply this mechanism where if you want to be accepted, you want to be considered part of the club, you just internalize what the dominant narratives are. And for whatever reason, during Russiagate, those lines between left media and mainstream media just got pummeled even more than they were before, whereas there used to be a distinction. I'm wondering your thoughts on that, if you agree with my analysis there.
I do. Just going back to the thesis of Chris Hayes' book, the argument was not that well-intentioned, smart people enter institutions and become consciously corrupt by knowingly lying, by saying things they know are false in order to keep their job. That's just like primitive corruption. That wasn't his argument. That's not what made it an interesting book. The idea of the book was when you get immersed in a particular culture, you start absorbing its pieties and orthodoxies, and you start seeing the world through the prism of the people that you're constantly around. And then you have subliminal positive encouragement. I think one of the things we have to realize is, human beings are political and social animals. We have that in our DNA. 10,000 years ago, if you were ostracized from your tribe, it meant that you would die. Being part of a tribe and accepted within a tribe was something necessary for survival. So we evolved needing that. And that's why things like shame and ostracization are things that we fear so much. So, I totally agree with you that it doesn't have to be this kind of overt conspiracy. It's what Noam Chomsky always used to say to these journalists in that iconic interview he did.
Well, I know some of the best and best known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Where he was speaking to a BBC journalist who kept mocking Chomsky's media theories about propaganda and manufacturing consent by saying, I don't ever get told what to say and what I can't say. And Chomsky said, oh no, I'm sure you're telling the truth about that. I believe that you believe everything you're saying. My point is that if you didn't believe it, you wouldn't be in that seat. You wouldn't be the BBC host. So all of these cultural pressures get put on people to shape what they say and what they think. People have asked me before, like the article that I wanted to write for The Intercept about the Hunter Biden story, it wasn't even really new reporting. It was just my analysis of what these documents showed. It was a media critique of the failure on the part of media organizations to take seriously the questions that they raised and to pursue those questions. It had no chance of like swinging the election, right? It wasn't like a big scoop that I had. I wasn't doing original reporting on the laptop itself by publishing documents. It would have made no difference. So why would the Intercept editors risk my leaving or alienating me so much when I'm the co-founder? I bring in more traffic than anybody by far, more donations, to stop my article. Obviously, it wasn't because they thought that my article would actually swing the election. It was because they had spent 4 years being accused in their social circles of having helped Donald Trump win and Hillary Clinton lose, because we did so much reporting on the DNC and Podesta archives and did a lot of critical reporting on Hillary Clinton. And they felt like they were within their own milieu kind of, looked at in a negative way, which is a very powerful incentive. And they did not want to spend 4 more years, even if Trump lost, being yet again accused. Oh, look, right before the election, you tried to sabotage Biden by publishing this critical article about him using Hunter Biden. They were so afraid of what their Brooklyn liberal and leftist friends were going to say that just shaped how they viewed my article. And again, it wasn't this conscious corruption or conspiracy, which is, oh, we know this article should be published journalistically, but corruptly we want to censor it because we want to help Biden win or because we want to avoid recriminations by our friends. It's much more insidious than that. It's much more subliminal. It's just people get influenced by their cultural surroundings. And if you're immersed in a culture where homogenous views reign, you will end up subservient to those views because there's so many punishments and so many recriminations from going contrary to them and so many rewards from embracing them.
And accordingly, I'm wondering if there's a connection possibly between these fundraising emails that I keep getting from the Intercept claiming that their donations are way down and the fact that your Substack is a wild success.
Well, I do find it interesting. If you look at the most successful Substack pages, almost all of generating a large amount of money, amounts of money that are significant to these failing outlets. Most of them have either been driven out of these failing outlets because of their heresies ideologically, or felt so uncomfortable within them that they basically left because they felt like they couldn't comfortably stay there any longer. And so it is ironic and almost karmic justice that these outlets, by becoming so repressive and by refusing to air any kind of dissent from this homogeneity, are not only becoming journalistically corrupt, right? It's very corrupt journalistically not to air dissent to the things that you're saying, but they're also, it's a form of suicide. Nobody wants to read, 80 outlets that are all saying the same things constantly and excluding any dissent. So in a sense, they're digging their own graves by becoming these bastions of ideological homogeneity. If Democracy Now! Is going to become nothing more than, a slightly less produced version of MSNBC or a less financed version of the New York Times, why would anyone continue to watch Democracy Now! If it's just the same stuff? You just can go to the original source of the New York Times or MSNBC. That's why Huffington Post and BuzzFeed and Vulture and Vice and all the rest are failing, because they don't offer anything unique. And if someone within them does offer anything unique, they get driven out.
Well, it's my hope that Democracy Now! Will hear that, because unlike other outlets, I've seen it up close. They do listen to their audience, and they do, I think, have, I hope, the capacity to change. We'll leave it there. Glenn Greenwald, he writes at greenwald.substack.com, and the new book is Securing Democracy, My Fight for Press Freedom and Justice in Bolsonaro's Brazil. Glenn, thanks very much.
Always great talking, Aaron. Thanks for having me.